History often hides its darkest moments, not out of mercy but out of fear. In the late medieval heart of Europe, one king's sudden collapse into madness baffled chroniclers for centuries. His instability was recorded, but the cause was not. What happened in a sealed chamber beneath a royal fortress was deliberately erased, buried under ash and silence. Tonight, you will hear the story Bohemia never dared to preserve, the torture that shattered a king's mind. In the closing years of the 14th century, Bohemia stood as a fractured realm, exhausted by noble rivalries and suffocated by courtly intrigue. The kingdom once carried the pride of a flourishing crown, yet under King Wenceslaus IV, its foundations trembled with unrest. Chroniclers of the era often described him as unpredictable, a ruler blessed with intelligence but cursed with a temperament capable of turning volatile without warning. What they did not know, or perhaps chose not to write, was how deeply the king's instability had already taken root long before the kingdom witnessed its first open revolt. At court, whispers circulated with the quiet persistence of smoke escaping beneath a door. Servants spoke of sudden outbursts behind council walls, of nights when the king refused sleep and paced his chambers until dawn. Advisors reported difficulty in securing his attention, as if his thoughts drifted elsewhere, absorbed by concerns he never fully voiced. Though Wenceslaus maintained outward authority, an unsettling shift had begun to shadow his actions, a tension that suggested he was grappling with something neither political nor ordinary. Bohemia's nobles sensed vulnerability and pressed upon it, demanding more influence, more concessions, and more acknowledgement of their importance. Their insistence often struck the king as personal insult rather than political negotiation. This environment of constant pressure intensified the ruler's suspicion, leaving him convinced that hidden conspiracies sought to undermine him. In truth, factions within the aristocracy were indeed maneuvering behind closed doors, but most were motivated by ambition, not treason. Wenceslaus, however, viewed every objection as a calculated step toward his humiliation. The royal court reflected this growing unease. Diplomats arrived with cautious expressions, aware that a single misstep could invite fury. Clerks hesitated to deliver sensitive documents, fearing that ill-timed news might ignite another unpredictable reaction. Even seasoned advisors avoided raising issues that might provoke tension. Across Prague Castle's corridors, one could sense an invisible strain, the silent dread that accompanies a leader whose trust in others is steadily dissolving. Yet among the countless rumors that drifted through the stone halls, one stood apart. Some claimed that the king's deteriorating state did not begin with a gradual decline, but with a single night, sealed from record and whispered only in fragments. It involved an unnamed prisoner, a confidential report, and the king himself descending into a part of the castle seldom used. Though no chronicler ever recorded the event, the behavior that followed hinted at a truth too dangerous to preserve. Historians studying Wenceslaus's later decline have often paused at this void in the archival record. The sudden changes in his decision-making, the emerging cruelty in his judgments, and the distrust he projected onto those closest to him suggested a psychological rupture, something immediate, intimate, and profoundly destabilizing. But without official documentation, the origins of that rupture remained an unsettling mystery. As the kingdom drifted toward political fragmentation, the seeds of catastrophe had already been sown. The king's worsening paranoia, coupled with the nobles' escalating defiance, created a climate primed for disaster. And at the center of it stood a ruler increasingly convinced that betrayal surrounded him, waiting only for the right moment to strike. What no one yet understood was how far Wenceslaus would go to uncover threats real or imagined. A decision was approaching, one that would reshape not only his reign but his sanity, a decision rooted in fear, secrecy, and a single man whose name Bohemia tried to forget. Jan Havelka entered the royal court of Prague as an unremarkable figure, a scholar known more for his meticulous handwriting than for political ambition. Yet by the winter of 1391, his quiet presence had drawn the attention of King Wenceslaus IV in a way few could understand. Havelka had been tasked with compiling a confidential assessment of noble alliances, a document intended only for the king's eyes. Those who later recalled his final days described him as uneasy, aware that his work contained observations capable of provoking powerful men. He walked the halls with measured steps, sensing that the boundaries of his duty had placed him within reach of danger he could neither name nor avoid. His arrest occurred without ceremony, without formal charge, and without the usual procession of guards. Two men in the king's livery approached him shortly after dusk, requesting his presence for what they claimed was a routine clarification of his report. According to later testimonies from distant attendants, Havelka hesitated only once before following them, down a narrow stairway seldom used by courtiers. The king's direct involvement became clear when the scholar was escorted not to an administrative chamber, but to a private antechamber near Wenceslaus's quarters. There, the door was sealed and no record was made of the encounter. The absence of documentation was itself a silent proclamation of the crown's intention. Havelka's report had detailed shifting loyalties among Bohemian nobles, but one section stood out, a discreet allusion to conversations overheard near the estates of a figure closely tied to the king. Though the document did not accuse anyone outright, its observations threatened to expose an embarrassing fissure within the royal household. Scholars have long debated whether Wenceslaus interpreted the report as betrayal or whether someone close to him manipulated its meaning to protect themselves. Either possibility placed Havelka in a precarious position. His scholarship, precise and unembellished, had inadvertently crossed into political territory where truth held value only when convenient. In a court driven by fear and ambition, the man who knew too much often met an abrupt end. Witnesses later remarked on the eerie quiet that followed Havelka's disappearance. Clerks who had worked beside him noticed his desk cleared overnight, his tools removed with deliberate neatness. Courtiers avoided acknowledging the absence, as though speaking his name might implicate them in whatever had transpired. The few who inquired were reminded that the king's patience was worn thin, and questions about internal matters were unwelcome. Such silence indicated not merely an arrest, but a deliberate erasure, the kind reserved for individuals the crown intended never to return. Havelka's colleagues sensed that something extraordinary had occurred, something that ventured beyond normal judicial procedure, yet none dared speculate aloud. In a kingdom unsettled by political fragility, caution became the first rule of survival. That evening, as torches flickered along the castle walls, rumors slipped through the servants' quarters with unsettling speed. Some insisted the king had demanded secrecy to prevent panic. Others believed he feared the report's contents might spread beyond control. Whatever the reason, the abruptness of the arrest confirmed that Wenceslaus no longer trusted traditional channels of investigation. Instead, he sought private resolution, unrecorded and unrestrained. Havelka's quiet removal marked a threshold the king had hesitated to cross. It foreshadowed decisions guided less by justice than by instinct, suspicion, and an intensifying dread of betrayal. The scholar's fate, though still unknown, would soon reshape the king's unraveling mind. Its consequences were only beginning. Karlštejn Castle, perched above the Barunka River, had long been regarded as the fortress of Bohemia's most sacred treasures. Its upper towers guarded royal regalia and holy relics, but beneath its foundations lay a very different kind of chamber, one that never appeared in official blueprints or architectural records. Only a handful of kings and select custodians knew of its existence. For centuries, it remained a whispered suspicion among historians, a hidden place reserved not for criminals, but for individuals whose knowledge threatened the stability of the crown itself. By the time Jan Havelka was transferred there, the chamber had not been used in over a generation. The decision came directly from King Wenceslaus IV. Those involved later remarked on the king's unusual insistence that Havelka be removed from Prague entirely, taken away from formal courts and inquisitorial oversight. The transfer occurred at night, with a small escort instructed not to question their orders. Havelka, bound but unharmed, was placed in a covered cart and sent toward Karlštejn under strict secrecy. The journey took hours, moving through forest paths rather than main roads to avoid detection. When they arrived, The escorts were met by a single royal steward who led them past the main halls, through a rear corridor seldom lit, and down a concealed stairwell carved within the rock itself. The prison was less a cell block than an engineered void, a space designed to separate prisoners from light, time, and human contact. Its walls had been reinforced centuries earlier, not for structural safety but to prevent sound from carrying. No chains hung from the ceilings, no racks or brutal devices cluttered the floor. Instead, the chamber relied on emptiness. Those who entered often reported a disorienting stillness, a silence that pressed against the senses with suffocating weight. It was an environment crafted to break resolve without leaving physical evidence, a place where the mind became its own torment. Upon arrival, Havelka was placed on a wooden bench and left there without explanation. Records do not indicate whether he pleaded, resisted, or remained silent. The chamber preserved only isolation, not testimony. A single torch illuminated the space briefly before the steward extinguished it and departed, locking the heavy door behind him. In that moment, the castle reclaimed the scholar into its most concealed depths. Days would pass before anyone else entered the chamber. For now, the darkness stood as both his companion and his judge. Meanwhile, the king's paranoia intensified. By removing Havelka from Prague, Wenceslaus had effectively taken full ownership of the scholar's fate. Advisors questioned the necessity of using Karlštejn, yet none dared voice their concerns openly. Those closest to the king sensed he sought to manage the situation personally, unwilling to trust court officials or ecclesiastical tribunals. The idea that noble conspirators might reach Havelka, or that the scholar might recant, seemed to haunt him. The king believed secrecy was his only defense, a belief formed not from reason but from the fear that had begun to dominate his decisions. Historians interpret this choice as a pivotal moment in Wenceslaus's decline. Sending a simple court scholar to such a place reflected more than caution. It revealed a ruler grappling with the unbearable possibility of betrayal within his inner circle. Instead of seeking counsel, Wenceslaus chose isolation, mirroring the very environment he had forced upon Havelka. The king's descent now ran parallel to the scholar's suffering, each confined by a darkness of his own making. Soon, these paths would converge in a way that neither realm nor crown could withstand. In the dim hours before dawn, King Wenceslaus IV descended the hidden stairway beneath Karlštejn Castle, accompanied only by a steward carrying a torch. Jan Havelka had spent several days in darkness, and the king's arrival marked the first time anyone had entered the chamber since his confinement. Wenceslaus insisted upon solitude, dismissing the guards and ordering the door sealed behind him. What followed would never appear in official records, but the consequences reshaped his reign. The king brought no instruments of physical punishment. Instead, he carried a small bundle of documents and a list of questions written in his own hand. His intention was not to break the scholar's body, but to erode his certainty, fracture his composure, and force him to confess to conspiracies that might not have existed. Wenceslaus believed truth emerged only when a man's sense of stability was dismantled. Fear and disorientation became his chosen tools. Havelka was ordered to stand while the king read fabricated accusations. Each claim contradicted the last, enclosing the scholar in a labyrinth of shifting narratives. One moment, Wenceslaus insisted he possessed proof of treason. The next, he accused Havelka of concealing allies. The contradictions were deliberate, crafted to disorient and weaken. Historians describe this form of interrogation as psychological mutilation, inflicting damage without leaving visible wounds. The king then demanded that Havelka repeat each accusation as though it were his own confession. When the scholar hesitated, Wenceslaus stepped closer, insisting refusal confirmed guilt. The scholar struggled to defend himself against charges that changed with every exchange. The king controlled not only the questions but the very meaning of truth, stripping Havelka of any stable ground on which to stand. At intervals, Wenceslaus introduced letters allegedly written by nobles who had confessed to plotting with the scholar. These documents were forgeries crafted by royal scribes. Havelka recognized handwriting resembling that of acquaintances, Yet subtle inconsistencies made him doubt his own memory. Each forged confession deepened his uncertainty, further unraveling his ability to trust his recollections. Hours passed as the king repeated the cycle of accusation, contradiction, and forced recitation. Havelka's voice weakened, but Wenceslaus pressed on. Witness accounts suggest the king grew increasingly agitated, his frustration driven not by the scholar's answers, but by his own fear that hidden betrayals surrounded him. Wenceslaus did not seek information so much as reassurance confirmation that his suspicions held weight. By the time the king stepped back, the scholar had been reduced to a trembling figure, psychologically battered yet still clinging to fragments of reason. Wenceslaus interpreted this resistance not as honesty, but as evidence of deeper deceit. His paranoia now guided every decision. In that chamber, a boundary was crossed. The king's desire for certainty transformed into an obsession that demanded the breaking of another mind to soothe his own. Outside the chamber, the steward watched the king emerge pale and unsteady, the weight of the encounter clinging to him like a burden. He offered no explanation, only a curt order that no one was to enter the room. The secrecy surrounding the session spread through Karlštejn, deepening unease among those who sensed the king had crossed a threshold from which he would not return. The torchlight inside the hidden chamber flickered against the stone walls as King Wenceslaus IV dismissed the steward with a single sharp gesture. The man hesitated only briefly before obeying, retreating through the door and securing it behind him. For the first time since Jan Havelka's capture, the king stood entirely alone with the scholar. No guards, no scribes, no witnesses. Just the ruler of Bohemia and the man he believed held the final thread of a widening conspiracy. Havelka, weakened by days of disorientation and sleeplessness, struggled to rise when the king approached. His restraint was not physical. The chamber required no shackles. Exhaustion had already accomplished what iron could achieve. His eyes followed Wenceslaus with the desperate instinct of a man seeking clarity in the unpredictable, but the king himself no longer embodied clarity. His breath was uneven, and the tremor in his hands revealed the turmoil roiling inside him. Wenceslaus began with questions, but these were no longer strategic inquiries. They tumbled out in erratic bursts, accusations of betrayal, assertions of plots, demands for names that shifted with each passing moment. He stepped close, then abruptly withdrew, pacing as though battling thoughts he could not organize. The controlled psychological pressure he had applied earlier had given way to raw, unrestrained agitation. The boundary between interrogation and personal rage began to dissolve. When Havelka attempted to respond, insisting he had no part in any conspiracy, the king interpreted the denial as confirmation of guilt. He grabbed the scholar by the collar, shaking him with a force that betrayed panic more than purpose. The act marked the moment Wenceslaus crossed into territory from which a ruler should never step. His authority was no longer expressed through the structures of law or court. It was expressed through his own hands. According to later accounts from those who saw the king after that night, something inside him broke during this confrontation. Alone with Havelka, Wenceslaus demanded a full confession, but the scholar's exhaustion left him incapable of forming coherent replies. Silence infuriated the king more than any declaration of guilt could have. He struck Havelka, not with weapons, but with the primal violence of a man cornered by his own fears. Each blow carried the weight of suspicion he had harbored for months. The scholar collapsed, yet the king continued demanding answers that no longer aligned with any consistent narrative. Wenceslaus insisted that the scholar reveal who had persuaded him to gather information, who had orchestrated secret councils, who sought to undermine royal authority. The questions circled the chamber like frantic shadows, more reflective of the king's inner chaos than of any genuine conspiracy. As Havelka's strength faded, the king knelt beside him, gripping his jaw and forcing him to look upward. The desperation in Wenceslaus's expression revealed a truth he could never publicly admit. He no longer sought to discover betrayal. He sought to justify his fear. The scholar's inability to provide a confession, real or fabricated, was the final push that sent the king beyond the edge. What happened in the last minutes of their encounter remained sealed in silence. But when Wenceslaus finally left the chamber, the scholar did not leave with him. The king's cloak was stained, his breaths ragged, his stare unfocused. At that moment, the ruler of Bohemia had crossed from sovereign to executioner, and the act carved an irreversible fracture into his already fragile mind. The darkness he left behind was not confined to the chamber. It would follow him into every decision thereafter. When the heavy door of the chamber groaned open at dawn, the guards waiting in the corridor stiffened. They had expected the king to call for them during the night, or at least to summon an attendant. Instead, Wenceslaus emerged alone, moving with the mechanical precision of someone forcing himself through each motion. His face bore the pallor of sleeplessness, and his cloak had been hastily adjusted, as if to conceal what it had been stained with hours earlier. Without meeting anyone's gaze, he announced that the interrogation was complete. He stated that he had extracted the truth, a phrase that carried the tone of finality, but none of the clarity usually required in royal proceedings. The guards exchanged uneasy glances, sensing immediately that something in their sovereign had shifted. No written confession accompanied him. No verbal summary was offered. He did not mention the scholar's fate, and no one dared to ask. Protocol dictated that any confession, especially one related to treason, be recorded by scribes for inclusion in the royal archives. But when the chancellor gently inquired if documentation would be required, the king dismissed him with a sharp wave, insisting that the matter was closed. His voice quivered despite his attempt to sound authoritative. The chancellor noted the trembling in the king's hands as he adjusted his gloves, a detail that would quietly circulate through the upper ranks of court by midday. Within hours, whispers formed. Guards who had approached the chamber found the door barred and no sign of Jan Havelka. Some assumed the scholar had been transferred elsewhere, but others noticed that no orders for relocation had been issued. The chamber itself remained untouched, locked by the king's personal seal. By noon, it became clear that the scholar had vanished, not executed publicly, not imprisoned, not exiled. Simply gone. His name, once present in the scribes' rolls, was suddenly absent. Pages referencing him were removed or altered with such haste that inconsistencies remained visible at the edges of the parchment. Clerks tasked with the revisions worked in tense silence, unsure whether they were preserving royal security or participating in something far more troubling. Meanwhile, Wenceslaus retreated into the private wing of Prague Castle, refusing counsel and limiting his interactions to terse commands issued through intermediaries. Those allowed near him reported a hollow stare, as if he were looking not at them, but through them. He declined food, declined wine, and most unsettling of all, declined sleep. Servants passing his chamber late at night heard him pacing slow, steady steps that continued until dawn. The royal physician, summoned only after the queen expressed concern, found the king seated at a table with his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. When asked if he was unwell, Wenceslaus insisted that he was perfectly in command, yet the tremor in his voice betrayed instability. He refused any examination and demanded to be left alone. In council meetings, his behavior became erratic. He interrupted discussions with abrupt changes of topic, contradicted his own decisions within minutes, and scrutinized every advisor as if measuring their loyalty by the angle of their posture. What had once been caution had evolved into volatility. The chancellor found it impossible to determine which matters could safely be raised, for the king's reactions no longer followed any predictable logic. The unrecorded confession, never written, never spoken aloud, hung over the court like a silent threat. Everyone sensed that something had occurred in the chamber that night, something grave enough to unbalance the monarch. But with the only other witness gone without a trace, the truth existed only in the king's mind, unstable and inaccessible. From that day forward, Wenceslaus ruled not through policy or counsel, but through impulses shaped by an event he refused to acknowledge. And the court, uncertain of how close they stood to provoking him, moved cautiously around a man whose authority had become inseparable from his unraveling sanity. In the weeks that followed Havelka's disappearance, An unmistakable tension settled over Prague Castle. Ministers walked its corridors with the cautious awareness of men navigating a collapsing structure, each footstep deliberate, each sentence rehearsed before it left their lips. No decree was issued acknowledging what had happened in the hidden chamber, yet everyone behaved as though something irreversible had shifted at the heart of the monarchy. Wenceslaus attended council meetings irregularly, arriving without warning or sending word at the last minute that he would not appear. When he did attend, his demeanor changed from moment to moment. At times he sat slumped in his chair, distant and unfocused, as if listening to something only he could hear. At other moments he erupted with sudden fury, accusing advisors of incompetence or treachery based on the smallest hesitation in their responses. No one dared question him, for his unpredictability had become its own form of authority. One morning, during a discussion on tax disputes in Moravia, the king abruptly demanded the arrest of a minor nobleman for disloyal phrasing. The phrase in question was nothing more than a poorly worded request for clarification, but the king insisted it carried hidden meaning. Guards removed the man within minutes. None of the council members intervened. They simply observed, silent and pale, as the king defended his accusation with increasingly strained logic. The nobleman reappeared 3 days later, visibly shaken, and immediately requested exile from the kingdom. Stories like this multiplied. Servants found themselves reprimanded for imagined slights. A bow performed too slowly, a message delivered with insufficient deference. A stable hand was publicly humiliated after Wenceslaus claimed the man had looked at him with accusation. The man insisted he had done nothing wrong, but the king ordered him whipped anyway, stating that disrespect grows in small gestures. Even those closest to him, including members of the royal guard, began avoiding eye contact with their sovereign for fear he would perceive judgment in their expressions. The royal council struggled to maintain cohesion. Some advised patience, arguing that the king's instability would pass if left unchallenged. Others pushed for intervention, fearing that his behavior threatened the entire political structure of Bohemia. But none dared to confront Wenceslaus directly. The memory of Havelka's unexplained disappearance loomed in every discussion. If a low-ranking scholar could vanish without a trace, what protection did higher officials truly possess? The queen attempted several times to speak with her husband privately, hoping to understand the cause of his agitation. Each attempt failed. Wenceslaus avoided her questions, diverting conversations to unrelated topics or retreating into prolonged silences. She noticed his habit of glancing toward empty corners, as if expecting someone to emerge. His sleep remained fragmented, punctuated by restless movements that left his bed untouched for hours at a time. Though he never mentioned the scholar, something in his gaze suggested that the memory continued to weigh heavily on him, pressing into every moment of his waking life. Rumors spread beyond the castle walls. Merchants arriving in the capital carried tales of a king who punished imagined insults and dismissed loyal officials without cause. The nobility began holding private meetings, ostensibly to discuss regional matters, but in truth to prepare for the possibility of royal collapse. Many feared that the monarch's instability might invite foreign opportunism or spark internal revolts. Within the castle, a single truth shaped daily life. No one felt secure. Every individual, from seasoned advisors to kitchen servants, understood that a wrong word or uncertain gesture might bring sudden ruin. The king's authority had become a weapon that could turn on anyone at any moment. And through this atmosphere of fear, one question lingered quietly, unspoken yet universally understood. If the king could cross the line between ruler and executioner once, what prevented him from crossing it again? By autumn, the deterioration of Wenceslaus's state of mind was no longer something confined to the private chambers of the castle. It seeped into public spaces, council rooms, ceremonial halls, and the corridors that connected them, leaving courtiers uncertain about what version of their ruler they might encounter at any moment. The king, who once relied on instinct and political acumen, now moved with the unease of a man trapped inside his own decisions. The first indication that something deeper was unraveling came during a routine procession through the coronation hall. Wenceslaus halted mid-stride, staring at a polished metal shield mounted along the wall. Those walking behind him stopped as well, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. The king leaned closer, narrowing his eyes as if struggling to identify a detail invisible to everyone else. When an attendant gently asked whether something was amiss, Wenceslaus dismissed him sharply and continued walking. But his posture had changed, rigid, guarded, as though he expected someone to appear behind him at any moment. Over the following days, similar behaviors emerged. He avoided reflective surfaces, turning his head away from mirrors, polished armor, even the smooth finish of ceremonial chalices. When he did encounter reflections unexpectedly, his reaction was immediate: a tightening of his jaw, a flicker of alarm in his eyes, a hurried step away from the object. No explanation was given, yet his attendants recognized that something unseen was provoking him. The sightings grew more frequent. While crossing the corridor leading to the council chamber, Wenceslaus abruptly stepped aside, pressing his back to the wall as if making room for someone walking toward him. But no one was there. On another afternoon, he paused at the threshold of his study and stared into the dim interior with a look of unmistakable recognition, followed quickly by dread. He refused to enter, instructing a guard to bring him the documents he needed instead. Despite attempts by those around him to maintain a sense of normalcy, the king's avoidance of the castle's lower levels caused significant complications. Administrative archives, communication rooms, and key storage chambers were all located beneath the main floors. Yet Wenceslaus refused to descend the staircases leading below ground. The reason became clear. After one particularly strained evening, he ordered that torches be placed along the upper stairwell, but insisted the lower steps remain unlit and untouched. His command was simple but firm. No one was to enter the lower passages unless absolutely necessary. He never spoke about the night in the chamber, but the fear in his movements suggested that the memory followed him everywhere. He did not need to articulate what he saw. Those around him could sense the weight of it in the way he flinched at distant footsteps or scanned corners before entering a room. His days became dictated not by schedules or political demands, but by the routes he could take without passing near the spaces that reminded him of the scholar. Council meetings grew shorter and less productive. Wenceslaus often cut discussions prematurely, claiming exhaustion or sudden illness. Advisors found him distracted, his eyes drifting toward doorways or settling on empty chairs as though expecting someone to appear. He began arriving late, sometimes choosing not to appear at all, leaving decisions suspended and tensions rising. His reign, once defined by inconsistencies and occasional harshness, had shifted into paralysis. Tasks he would have handled without hesitation now stalled under his uncertainty. Messages went unanswered, petitions stacked on his desk, and regional disputes escalated in the absence of leadership. The court understood, though no one dared voice it aloud. The king was not haunted by the supernatural, nor by external enemies, but by the memory of a man whose absence he could neither justify nor forget. The corridors of the castle had become a map of reminders, and every reflection a window into a moment he desperately wished to erase. The winter night that marked Wenceslaus's final attempt to reclaim control over his unraveling mind began without ceremony. Snow had fallen steadily throughout the day, muffling the castle grounds in a silence that felt absolute. Servants extinguished torches early, and corridors emptied quickly, for no one wished to linger after dark when the king's temper could swing without warning. Yet while the rest of Karlštejn retreated into uneasy quiet, Wenceslaus prepared for a task he believed would free him from the weight he carried. He sent for only 3 men, a chamberlain, a scribe, and a guard. All were loyal enough to follow orders without questions, yet wary enough to sense the danger in his summons. Wenceslaus instructed them to gather every document bearing the scholar's name, reports, letters, files from the royal chancery, and any parchment connected to the investigation that had led to the man's arrest. Though the scholar's existence had already been scrubbed from official registers, traces remained in hidden correspondence and private notes. The king demanded they be found. Over several hours, the men brought bundles of parchment and sealed scrolls to the courtyard overlooking the old well. The king waited there, wrapped in a heavy cloak, pacing slowly as each armload arrived. He inspected every piece, scanning the writing with deliberate care before tossing it aside. By the end, the pile reached almost to his waist, a mound of paper representing the remnants of a life he was determined to erase. Wenceslaus ordered a brazier brought forward and lit. The flames rose quickly, fed by dry oak kindling. For a long moment, he stood still, watching the fire grow. The light flickered across his face, revealing exhaustion etched deep into his features. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a brittle edge. He commanded the scribe to hand him the first set of documents. One by one, Wenceslaus sped them into the brazier. The edges curled, darkened, and vanished into ash. He leaned close to ensure every fragment burned completely, occasionally using a poker to press stubborn parchment deeper into the flames. The three servants kept their distance, sensing that this was not an administrative disposal but a private ritual, one born from fear rather than governance. As the fire consumed the documents, the king muttered under his breath. None of the men could hear clearly, but the cadence suggested repetition, phrases whispered again and again as if pleading with the flames for release. His hands trembled. Whether from the cold or from the strain of the moment, no one could tell. He was not destroying evidence to protect his authority. He was destroying memory in an attempt to silence it. When the final scroll was handed to him, Wenceslaus hesitated. The parchment bore the original accusation that had led to the scholar's arrest. He stared at it longer than the others, his eyes shifting between the ink and the fire beside him. Then, with a forceful sweep of his arm, he thrust it into the brazier and stepped back sharply, as though the act had burned him even before the flames touched the parchment. As the last pieces turned to cinders, he ordered the brazier dumped into the snow and extinguished. The chamberlain obeyed, scattering ash into the wind. A faint gust carried the remnants across the courtyard stones. Wenceslaus looked at the floating fragments with an expression that blended relief and despair. He had destroyed the past, yet nothing within him had changed. The memory remained. The chamber beneath the castle remained, and the weight he carried pressed heavier than ever. He turned away without a word. In the final stretch of Wenceslaus IV's life, the castle that once served as his seat of authority became a labyrinth he rarely dared to cross. Days passed without him stepping beyond his private chambers. Advisors waited in corridors for hours, hoping he might emerge long enough to sign decrees or hear petitions, but the king often remained behind closed doors, pacing endlessly, murmuring indistinct words to someone only he seemed to acknowledge. Servants learned to approach quietly and leave quickly, for any unexpected movement risked provoking a sharp and unpredictable reaction. His appearance changed as rapidly as his state of mind. Once accustomed to the dignity of royal attire, he now wore robes loosely tied, hair unkempt, eyes hollowed by weeks of sleepless nights. Meals arrived untouched. Wine sat half-finished on tables, staining the rims of cups with dried traces. The fire in his chamber burned constantly, yet he insisted on more logs, claiming drafts crept along the floor and chilled him even when the room glowed with heat. The absence of the scholar weighed heavily on him, though he spoke nothing of the torture or the final night. Instead, his fragmented sentences circled the same anxieties: trust, betrayal, hidden threats he believed lived just beyond the reach of torchlight. At times, he addressed these fears aloud, speaking to an empty chair or turning toward a shadowed corner as though expecting a reply. Attendants overheard him asking for forgiveness or pleading for a truth he admitted he could no longer recall clearly. Council members made discreet attempts to intervene, but none succeeded. Any suggestion that he rest, delegate, or retreat from governance only triggered defensive outbursts. Attempts to remove certain responsibilities from him ended abruptly when he accused those involved of plotting to seize his authority. The royal court fractured under the strain. Some nobles withdrew from public duties, fearing the king might turn on them without cause. Others stayed close to monitor the situation, hoping to prevent unpredictable decisions from spiraling into larger crises. Outside the castle walls, Prague sensed the growing instability. Messages from regional lords went unanswered for weeks. Reports of disputes and unrest accumulated with no resolutions. Trade slowed as uncertainty spread. Rumors circulated quietly among merchants and clergy that the crown's future hung on a thread finer than anyone wished to admit. Inside the king's chamber, time blurred. Wenceslaus spent hours sitting before the window, watching snowfall pattern the courtyard below. On certain nights, he traced shapes in the frost, whispering to the empty air as though reaching for a presence only he could feel. He occasionally asked attendants to bring parchment, yet whatever he attempted to write ended in smeared ink and torn pages. The only constant was the tension in his face, an expression caught between regret and fear. His final days passed in near silence. One morning, after a night of restless wandering between the hearth and the window, Wenceslaus collapsed beside his bed. He was found lying on the cold floor, eyes half open, his breath shallow and uneven. Though attendants rushed to lift him, he resisted weakly, muttering a single name, the scholars, before falling into stillness. By nightfall, he was gone. No proclamation explained the cause. No statement acknowledged the secret that had consumed him. His death was recorded simply, without mention of the man whose disappearance had become the hinge on which the king's sanity turned. Yet those who had witnessed his decline understood what the record would never reveal. The crown had not been taken from Wenceslaus by war, treason, or illness, but by the memory of a single act he could neither justify nor escape. In the end, it was not an enemy that destroyed him. It was the weight of a truth he could not bear to keep living with.